Hello. My name is Mars Tsaporic. I'm a researcher at Center for East European Policy Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the opening of a new book. Back in 2015, we presented a book titled A War in Ukraine, Lessons for Europe. This year, this opening is for a book titled A War in Syria, Lessons for West. So we have already two books. I'm somehow divided on should we have a third one, because we would need a third war for that. So
I'm afraid you will get it, but
we'll see. We'll see. But and here today we have three of the authors of the three from the 10 overall authors from a book, and they will briefly look at their main conclusions from what they have written. But before that, I will give word to Mr. Andis Kudors, Executive Director for Center for East European Policy Studies, for some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Maris. Why our think tank, which is located here and based here in Riga in Latvia, why we are studying something which is happening so far, but what is far and what is nearby nowadays? In our globalized world, in interdependent world, I believe everything is nearby. So, and besides that, if our center is focusing in our studies on Russia, especially on Russian foreign policy, and if Russia goes to Ukraine, we are following as the researchers. If Russia goes to Syria, for us it's interesting to understand why and what they are doing there. If Russia will go to Arctic, to the Mars, probably we will follow. But about Mars, probably Mars separates will follow on rocket, because if I will go, they will need to spend too much fuel for rockets. So, but I'm happy that we were able to involve so many distinguished researchers from different countries. Like there were 3 authors from United States, 1 from Great Britain, 2 from Germany, 2 from Turkey, and of course we here from Latvia. So thank you for your job, thank you for your efforts, and of course thank you to our financial supporters. One was European People's Party group in European Parliament and Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Thank you so much that because of you this book came to alive. I remember we presented the book Maris mentioned, The War in Ukraine, Lessons for the Europe, in Brussels, together with Artis Publics, and he came up and said, let's make another, the same one, like continuation, about war in Syria. I said, of course, let's do it. So thank you for this idea, Artis. And thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Andis. And next I would ask Ms. Elizabeth Bauer, who is head of Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Baltic countries and Scandinavia.
Thank you for the choice to say thank you to all our partners in this project. And the Riga conference always deals with current topics connected to a lot of different aspects of security policy. As we all know, nowadays we have not only to face Crimea and Ukraine as one of the threats of international developments, but as well the war in Syria. Due to this, it was just a lucky chance that we can present today the book, The War in Syria, Lessons for the West. Thanks for being in time with it. The book is just another joint project in a long row between the Center for East European Policy Studies, represented by Andis Kudors, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and the EPP group, represented by our good friend Artis Publics. Thanks a lot. All of us are very much aware of the situation down there, and there are a lot of different discussions about how to deal with the problem, where the mistakes have been made, or whether there would have been any other chance to deal with the topic, and so on. So we have to thank for the initiative to put together different aspects of the topic from different positions, at least to try to clarify some of those positions. Andis Kudors and Artis Publics edited a volume which put together European and American points of view, as well as the role of propaganda, the possible geopolitical outcome, and what all this means to the region itself. or this even represented by authors from Latvia, Poland, Germany, Great Britain, United States, and Turkey. And what this publication makes it worse is really the analysis about lessons learned, those we still need to learn and those we might have to learn for future. So thanks to all authors who contributed to the books and to the editors for having the idea and putting it all together. Thanks for your attention.
Yeah, thank you. And now we turn to three people who are sitting here in the panel. First we have Mr. Atis Pabriks, who is currently a representative from Latvia in the European Parliament, former Latvian Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defense. Next we have Ms. Liz Wall, who is former news anchor, a famous news anchor for RT American branch. And then we have Professor Julian Lindley French also. I tried to read before what are your titles, and your titles take up around 2 sentences. So very widely known person on security and European security related issues. But first, let's turn to Mr. Pabriks. So your conclusions, your ideas about the book and about the topic as such.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, first of all, of course, I would like to follow the pattern which was mentioned before. I really would like to thank Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and also particularly Mr. Kudors and Center for East European Policy Studies here for really being very open to this idea and project, because, you know, to actually make such a project in a relatively short period of time when the things are changing and you are facing a challenge of permanent reanalysis of what is happening, it's not easy. But at the same time, you know, it is, on the other hand, it's very easy to make analysis or complain or shout already after the battle is over. So at this stage, when things are changing so much, and so much is at stake in the security in Europe and in the world in general, I don't think we can afford the pleasure simply to lie back in the armchair and tell, look, you know, we will be super objective, we will wait until the crisis or war is over, and then we will come up in 10 years with our analysis. We have to do it now, because in many ways, I think this is also somehow of a policy paper with intention to open eyes for politicians, for analysts, for academicians, and for general public. And I think it's highly important, because we hear now that very much, especially in the Western world, there are claims on the streets that we want more participation, that we want really to have a transparency in decision making. But we also know from studies of political science that it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to imagine a mature democracy without smart citizens. So we cannot just afford to have a decision making on the streets if people are not really capable to face and analyze all the consequences of their decisions. So this is a very big challenge for current liberal democracies. Now, this book, as you could see, is a compilation of the work of different authors, and I'm particularly happy that at least 2 of them are here, because in some way there's one thing which unites all 3 of us which are sitting here. I'm not speaking about Andis, he probably is of the same nature. We tend to say what we think, and it's not always extremely pleasant. Maybe sometimes it has a little bit more pepper, but if we would not do this, then there would be much, much less chance really to come to open and full-fledged and fruitful discussion on political issues. And I think empty talks we have a lot around. So by telling this, I think I'm soon to finishing, because there is nothing worse as long political speeches. As far as this book and content, there will be chapters where not everything is on what we 100% each of us agree, but I think the major tendency is there are certain things which probably will need a further analysis and follow-up, because political situation is continuing. We could see in this book that we have been trying to present and analyze these different viewpoints, and also this kind of a mixture of a warfare, of hybrid warfare, what we are facing at this moment, either in Ukraine, which was a previous book, or in this one, where you could see the conventional weapons, you can see a psychological warfare, we can see a media and strategic communication issues, where particularly I'm happy that Ms. Wahl is here, because she's the one of you in the West who was inside of that very successful Russian propaganda apparatus, and successfully got out of this. And I think it's very nice that she is also capable to share her opinion on this. I think that Julian's position here is highly important, because he is representing the country which is at this moment one without which, on the one hand, it's extremely difficult to imagine a secure European environment or even solution of conflicts like Syria, but on the other hand, the one which is trying to drag its feet a little bit back on the island. And I must tell personally and subjectively, if really Brexit happens, you know, we will very much miss the British participation. And then we all are facing, because of these events, the increased populism all over in our countries, which in fact is making our transatlantic ties much weaker, which is making our Atlantic Ocean much deeper and broader, which is very difficult for us. Just like with our Turkish participants, which are trying to explain the Turkish policies and attitudes towards conflict in Syria, at the same time facing the increased post-coup political consequences at home. I try sometimes to be diplomatic. I can be if I want, actually. And this is also one of the issues where we can criticize also in some way ourselves, because at least this is what was my small input in foreword and also in summary here, that I think that we don't need always to complain about those which are in opposition to our policies or our interests, but we should look what we could do differently, better, faster, or more timely. And still, just like my let's say, critic in the previous book about war in Syria, the same critic prevails also here in the war on, the first was on Ukraine, now in war on Syria. The same prevails also here, that sometimes we are paying for delayed decisions more than we would pay for the timely or even sometimes partly wrong decisions. And the last sentence about Russia, which is also one of the last paragraphs here in our summary with Andis, is that even if we have a claim that there must be a united resilience against any aggressive moves from the Russian side, and there must be this united and resilient view on the European side against the Russian moves, we still claim that there is a necessity to keep doors open for negotiations and cooperation with Russia when it's possible. But it should not be on the expense of our fundamental values, of our unity, and that basically leads me to a conclusion, yes, open door policy, but also with open eye policy. Let's not be blind when bad things are happening nearby us. Thank you. I hope you will enjoy the reading, and we will enjoy your comments.
Okay, thank you. Now we turn to Professor Julian Lindy French. So you have a chapter that is titled quite topically. It's titled, "Can Europe Apply a Grand Strategy to a Grand Tragedy?" So what is in the chapter and what are the main conclusions?
Well, thank you very much. And I have to say it was a great honor to support my friends, artists and Andis in this endeavor. It fits neatly into a book that I've written with General John Allen, which is coming out in January, called Demons and Dragons, the New Geopolitics of Terror, which is really about the similar sort of issues. I was set this mission, and I approached it by asking 5 fundamental questions which Europeans have to address. What is the nature of the Syrian conflict? What is grand strategy? What is the scope and extent of Europe's grand strategic challenge? What are the barriers to European grand strategy? What can Europe hope to achieve? Now, my takeaway, my core message from the chapter is this. Europe, or rather the European Union, has become very good at talking about big action in pursuit of big ends, but rarely, if at all, very good at turning big talk into big action. Consequently, not only have Europeans retreated as strategic actors, Europe has increasingly become a victim of geopolitics rather than a shaper of it. And we really should be a shaper of geopolitics far more than we are today. What is the nature of the Syrian conflict? Well, the Syrian war is, in effect, a vacuum within which anarchy abounds and geopolitics is afoot. In the absence of a true strategic commitment by Europeans and the willingness to take the necessary risks needed in such a place, the best that Europe can aspire to is to mitigate the effects of such a conflict on Europe itself, but have little influence over helping to resolve the crisis itself. Which brings me to the question, what is grand strategy? Well, it's the application of immense means in support of high political ends. If any organization was ever created to achieve that, it was the European Union. But it needs to think and act big, and it needs to think and act big now, and not just over Syria, but also about Russia and other potential threats. What is the scope of the challenge that Europe faces? Well, Syria is the epicenter of conflicts across the Middle East that are now breaking out of one region and beginning to destabilize others. That is why a European comprehensive strategy is needed that works to affect equally at the ethnic, sectarian, regional, interregional, and geopolitical levels. It's all interconnected, folks. There's no easy answer here, and there's no short-term silver bullet to mix my metaphors. This is going to take a lot of resource, possibly at some point force, but strategic patience, commitment, and political consistency. So what are the barriers to Europeans doing that? Well, Albert Einstein once suggested that the only way to counter unimaginable gravitational pull of a black hole is with countervailing superior power. If Europe is to begin to generate grand strategy, it must play to its strengths: economic influence, diplomatic action, yes, and needs be with others on occasions, with partners, some military action. And if we are to close what is a humanitarian disaster unknown possibly since World War II, such power will mean much more than simply superior kinetic force. Speak to my friend John Allen, and he will tell you, general though he is, there is no military solution to this. You can't defeat ideologies with military power. Partnership in action will be required, but above all, it will take something which, with due respect to artisan and the political class in Europe, has for too long been lacking. A willingness to look at big dangers as they are, not as we would like it to be, and to stay the course over the long term to ensure that they are resolved. What can Europe hope to achieve? Well, that pretty much comes down to the level of political risk European leaders are prepared to take. But ultimately, the strategy itself that Europe could engage would have to be multifaceted. It would have to be offensive and defensive, in that it would need to engage the crisis in Syria, link those efforts to the management of refugee flows into Europe, and to mitigate the threat posed by IS, Daesh, not just in Europe, but in the region. It would have to have force and resource, be more focused on resource than force, but there will still need to be a significant element of force involved, focused on political transition, stabilization and reconstruction, rule of law, and post-conflict resolution and development. It would require us all to harmonize national strategies at a time when, frankly, we're beginning to fall apart. one thing I've noticed when I've been in the region is how European states, certain bigger states, one of which, to which I'm quite close, for example, still compete with each other in the Middle East. Compete for influence, compete for contracts, often undermining the comprehensive approach that we would need in the middle of this crisis. Europe would have to become as well a partnership hub. It may well be that the new administration in Washington could be willing to give Europeans at least the role of being a strategic broker in Syria, a strategic broker in Syria, because I'm convinced that the scale of this crisis is such that only by North Americans and Europeans working together can we possibly hope to realize the outcomes. Now, I spent quite a bit of time in Afghanistan over the last decade, and what struck me in Afghanistan was how often, for political reasons, we simply focused on the inputs of our investment and not on the outcomes they generate. If we are to seriously engage in that part of the world, after a century of failure, we're going to have a completely new outcomes-based concept of engagement to achieve the changes with our partners in the region, critical that we'll seek to generate. So, in conclusion, I think it's above all necessary that we now craft a plan. Which brings me to a minor comment, if I may, on Brexit. Brexit is a strategic distraction. Let's be sensible about this. The British people have made a choice. We might not like it. I didn't vote for Leave, surprising to artists though it was. I voted Remain, and I made speeches in support of Remain.
Thank you.
Good. Well, in the end, I came round to you artists. It was okay. And why? Because I stood in the snow in Lithuania at the snow meeting. And I couldn't imagine my country walking away from our partners and allies at such a dangerous moment. And for that moment, I rejected on geopolitical grounds any idea of Brexit. So please, let's deal with Brexit as the friends and allies that we are. Get it sorted out quickly, establish a new relationship, and get back to dealing with the real issues that we as Europeans need to confront. And one final comment, a quote, which kind of inspired the chapter. It came from Joe Nye, a professor in the US I know well, good friend. He said this: "Grand speeches are not enough. Anyone can produce a wish list. Effective visions must accurately diagnose the world situation, balancing idealism with risks and ideals with capabilities." Amen to that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now we turn to Ms. Wall, former news anchor at RT. So you wrote on propaganda, on Russian propaganda, on war in Syria, but you, of course, comment on this, but also I would like to ask overall expressions or impressions from your side, how as you are the person that was inside the system, the propaganda apparatus, so how it operates and what is the maybe thinking in there, and of course the examples from the Syrian case. So go ahead.
Right, yes. Well, that's the focus of my chapter in this book. And first of all, thank you to Dr. Pabriks and to the Center for East European Policy Studies and to the Konrad Adenauer's Foundation for making this project possible. So I come from kind of a unique perspective because I worked inside of a Russian-funded newsroom. And so I saw how this messaging was crafted and how it was disseminated and how this messaging was spread, disinformation. So the Russian media, they've been pushing the same narrative for years, but I think just in the past couple of years, it's grown even more aggressive and more deceptive. And the key messaging throughout is that the US and the West, at the best, is hypocritical, and at the worst, sinister players in a plot to for regime change throughout the world. And so really Russian media aims to shape the worldview of its consumers to be skeptical of the US, of the EU, of NATO, and other Western institutions, including the media. There's this idea that there's this Western-controlled monopoly on information, and their narrative is that they're getting out a hidden truth that isn't being conveyed in the Western media. And one reason why I think it is effective is that it plays on existing grievances within Western society. And we're seeing a lot of that now, even in the US in our own presidential campaign. So there's three kind of techniques in Russian media, and I identify them as to deny, deflect, and distort. So whenever there's something that becomes apparent, the Kremlin and the Kremlin-sponsored media will then just deny it and say that there's no proof. We see this time and time again. Also, this tactic of deflection, so basically to change the subject and make it about Western hypocrisy and make it about Iraq and just totally change the subject. And when those aren't employed, just distortion by cherry-picking facts, overlooking critical parts of the story, taking things out of context, or even manipulating information where it's not even close to the truth. So it's through these mechanisms that grains of truth are exaggerated, critical facts are omitted, and the greater context ignored to manufacture a story that furthers the Kremlin's foreign policy interests. And so the message there, that the government is a fraud, that the media can't be trusted, and now that the elections are rigged. And if you've been paying attention to the US elections, those words are very similar to what has come out of speeches from our own presidential candidate, Donald Trump, which we can go into later in terms of how Russian messaging and rhetoric has even made it into the mainstream. So my chapter focuses on Russia's propaganda on the war in Syria from the very early days. So even in the early days of the war, 2011, the seeds of the Russian narrative of the conflict in Ukraine were kind of planted. This is way before Russia's intervention into Syria. The media was used to deflect away from the atrocities that were being carried out by the Syrian government. And it really aimed to create this haze of confusion and blaming the Western media for taking sides and essentially making it seem like we weren't getting the truth and no facts could be established in this conflict. Another key part of the messaging here is not making any distinction between the rebel groups, so broadly portraying the opposition as comprised of extremist groups and blaming the US for direct and indirect support of terrorists. So we're seeing now the implications of that, of just branding the opposition as a whole as terrorists and not making any distinction there. So now, as we're seeing with the ruthless bombing of Aleppo, you can make the justification there, or what has been conveyed in Russian media is that essentially they're all terrorists there, so there are no civilians being bombed. From the beginning, this went along with Assad, the Syrian president's, his worldview at the time. According to him, there was no legitimate opposition, that any of the protesters were actually fomented by Western leaders. So, and then we're seeing that Putin, the Russian president, would echo that and use its media to amplify that message. And so moving on throughout the coverage, in 2013, it became apparent that the regime was using chemical weapons on its own people. And while the facts were coming out on that, Russian television was working very hard to debunk the Western storyline that would have justified retaliatory airstrikes back then. This was a red line for the United States, and but there was some negotiations. There was no military action that was taken, but very quickly Russian television was trying to actually frame it so the opposition was the one was responsible for using sarin gas on its own people. And so they would do this by cherry picking or finding voices, however unreliable, that would convey this narrative that it was actually the opposition that used it. So again, trying to blur the line, making it so you cannot establish fact from fiction. I remember that one voice that was highlighted was a Syrian nun. And she basically said that the videos of these lifeless bodies of children, women and children, that the video was faked. And she went on and was given a platform, and she went on this tour throughout the United States with anti-war groups. And so, so any kind of dubious evidence or any way to debunk what was actually happening there, even in regards to a war crime like the use of chemical weapons. So flash forward to September 2015, and that is when Russia invaded or launched their military intervention into Syria. And so at this point, the narrative had already been set. Even though Syria was a new battleground, the lines had already been drawn between good and evil. And so Russian media, the way that they frame this, including RT and Sputnik, is they went on this media blitz, essentially framing their intervention as being this heroic and bold military move to fight ISIS. And so it was, they called it this anti-terror operation, and that's what the headlines reflected. To read some of them here, I think I have some examples here. The defense ministry, terrorists fleeing in droves due to their strikes. And they would show video of, the new Russian equipment and their new military capabilities, and what they were doing to hit their anti-ISIS sorties, saying that they hit hundreds of terrorist targets. But in reality, it wasn't the terror. I mean, if you look at the actual evidence, in reality, they were not targeting ISIS hotbeds, but opposition strongholds. But that is not the story that you are getting in Russian media. So I think that there are some comparisons that can be made to the war in Ukraine, even though that they're two totally different conflicts. That they are vastly, different regions of the globe, but the language and the reporting and the messaging is strikingly similar. Both accuse the West of fomenting an uprising, denying the existence of a legitimate civil war, and aiming to overlook the humanitarian crimes and justify the rule and corruption of a brutal dictator. And in both cases, Russian media would demonize the opposition. So in Ukraine, the opposition was made up of fascists, neo-Nazis, and neocons. These are kind of the way that they brand the opposition. And in Syria, the opposition is broadly portrayed as terrorists, jihadists, and extremists. So when you have that kind of dichotomous framing of the conflict, you see now the UN humanitarian convoy was bombed, hospitals being targeted, civilians, and also, bakeries, everything just being targeted. And if you play into the Russian narrative, they're not bombing civilians because of the way that they frame the story. So I think in conclusion, I think that it's important to first be aware of the way that Russian media manipulates the narrative and the way that they try to make it impossible to separate fact from fiction, to make it so that the truth doesn't matter, that facts don't exist. I think that we need to get back to making the truth matter again. And because I think when facts can't be established, political leaders, first of all, the public does not feel compelled to act. You don't see the outrage there because there's this kind of exhaustion by not really understanding what's going on. You can't tell what's true, and it kind of paralyzes anybody from acting. If you can't establish basic facts, you can't really move forward. And so I think the challenge for the West also is to convince its own people to see through the messaging of a rogue government. We're seeing now, unfortunately, that the climate in the United States and in the West is very divisive. We're seeing the rise of the alt-right and extremist groups, and we're seeing a lot of disillusionment in the mainstream media and in our institutions. So that kind of sentiment makes it a situation in which the Kremlin can manipulate us from the inside. And they know how to manipulate us from the inside. So I think the challenge is for democratic governments and the mainstream institutions to encourage our own populations that a world in which facts don't matter and reality is manufactured is not a desirable alternative.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we will give opportunity for people in the audiences to ask some questions if there are any. So if you have some questions or maybe small comments, then raise your hand. No? Everybody wants. Okay, we have a question here. Do we have a mic? Yeah, mic is coming.
Thank you very much. Andras Schwartz from Helsinki, Finnish Institute of International Affairs. A very short question. I'm now behaving like the bad reader who read just the first page. If the book is about the lessons of the war from Syria, what are the lessons from the war in Syria for Russia? Thanks.
Okay, anybody's ready to answer this?
Well, I believe that school is not finished yet, but I would say that Russians have been approaching Syria after they already finished first two grades. And one grade was 2008, another in Georgia, another was in Ukraine. And in both cases, they could see that there is no any kind of strong response. There is no united response. Once the response is coming, it's delayed. It is very much compromise-seeking on the expense of those players which are, let's say, the Russian victims. And I would say that in some way that European and Western inability to stop Russians in Georgia, and moreover, it's even more difficult to stop timely and to react strongly or prevent, let's say, as a prevention, the occupation of Crimea and war in Donbass provoked also their activity in Syria. They understood they can do it. Because no matter what, nobody in the book, and I would be the last one to say that Russian analysts and militaries are stupid. They're smart, and they see the weaknesses. And I think we should concentrate here not only on analyzing how Russians are acting in these conflicts, but how we are acting and what is our weakness. So they do this, we should analyze ourselves. And we knew before that all those examples. Also, if you put back, if I'm correct, 1999, the Kosovo crisis, it's the same pattern. So actually, I would really claim and oppose everybody who is telling that Russian policies are so unpredictable. They're very predictable.
Okay, anyone else wants to add? Liz?
I guess to go along with that, I think that Russian media can almost be used as a barometer for what's going on. If they take the time, it seems like when they take the time to deny something in their own headlines, that they have something to hide. So it's almost like we can learn from their own propaganda what they're up to.
Well, I'll add to that. A, they think we're hypocrites. B, they think we're weak. C, they think that we don't really believe in the values we keep talking about. And D, there are no red lines. Bad message.
That's certainly a message that is conveyed and time again throughout Russian media.
Okay, any more questions or comments? If no, then we can end here. I would like to thank our authors and definitely thank our also, of course, the financiers, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, the EPP Group, and of course Latvian Transatlantic Organization and other organizers of the Riga conference for letting...
and Center for East European Policy Studies.
That is at the basis. But I guess the main conclusion is that we have had quite a lot of lessons, and now it's time for homework for Europeans, homework for overall transatlantic community, and understanding what is actually happening and how we should respond to not only what is happening to Syria, but outside our borders. So thank you for participating. The books will be available outside and near the info desk, so you can grab a copy, and afterwards also electronically they will be available on the website of Center for East European Policy Studies. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Liz, thank you very much. Nice to meet you. Thank you.